Why will God harden Pharaoh's heart and still punish the whole of Egypt for it? Imagine standing in front of the most powerful ruler in Egypt. You have no army, no weapons, no political influence, and then you look him in the eyes and tell him, "Let my people go." That was exactly what Moses did. But Pharaoh refused. And then, something strange happens throughout the story of Exodus. Sometimes the Bible says Pharaoh hardened his own heart, but in other places, it says God hardened Pharaoh's heart. So what does that actually mean? Did Pharaoh make his own decision? Or did God force him to become stubborn? And if God hardened Pharaoh's heart, was Pharaoh really responsible for what happened? Let's go back to ancient Egypt. If you have watched this video to this minutes, please comment where you are watching from. Let's go back to the story. Pharaoh wasn't just a king. He was considered one of the most powerful people on earth. And suddenly, Moses appears before him with a message from the God of Israel, "Let my people go." Pharaoh's response was basically, "Who is the Lord that I should obey him?" That question tells us a lot about Pharaoh. He wasn't simply confused. He wasn't asking for evidence. He was challenging authority. He had already made up his mind. And then, the plagues began. The Nile turned to blood. Frogs covered the land. Then came insects, disease, hail, darkness, and eventually the death of the firstborn. And after almost every major plague, something interesting happens. Pharaoh changes his mind. Sometimes he asks Moses to pray for the plague to stop. He promises to let Israel go. But when the pressure disappears, Pharaoh changes his mind again. So was God hardening his heart? Or was Pharaoh repeatedly hardening his own heart? Here's where the story becomes much deeper. The Bible doesn't present Pharaoh as an innocent man who suddenly became evil because God controlled him. In fact, before we read that God hardened Pharaoh's heart, we repeatedly see Pharaoh himself resisting, refusing, and hardening his own heart. In other words, Pharaoh was already going in that direction. Then the Bible begins describing God as hardening his heart. Think about it like this. Imagine someone repeatedly making the same decision. Every time they are given an opportunity to change, they refuse. Eventually, that decision becomes part of who they are. Their heart becomes harder. But wait, I have a question. If God is all-powerful, he won't need Pharaoh's permission to get the people of Israel out of Egypt. The story of Pharaoh may be showing us something about how repeated choices can shape a person. But there's another reason the Bible says God hardened Pharaoh's heart. God wanted the events in Egypt to reveal his power. That means he hardens Pharaoh's heart so that he can show his power. The plagues weren't only about punishing Egypt. They were also about demonstrating that the God of Israel was greater than the gods and powers Egypt trusted. And Pharaoh's resistance became part of that story. God even tells Moses beforehand that Pharaoh's resistance would provide an opportunity for God's power to be displayed. But here's the uncomfortable question. If God already knew Pharaoh would refuse, why didn't he simply change Pharaoh's heart? That's where the story forces us to think about free will, responsibility, and divine sovereignty. The Bible seems to hold two ideas together at the same time. Pharaoh was responsible for his choices, and God was still sovereign over the larger story. And maybe that's the real mystery. The story isn't simply saying God made Pharaoh evil. It's showing us what can happen when a person repeatedly refuses to listen. One refusal becomes another. One compromise becomes another, until eventually, the heart becomes so resistant that even overwhelming evidence doesn't change it. And perhaps that's why the story of Pharaoh is still relevant today. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't refusing the truth once. It's becoming so comfortable with refusing it that eventually you don't even want to hear it anymore. Pharaoh saw the plagues. He witnessed things he couldn't explain. He had opportunities to change, but again and again, he resisted, and eventually, his resistance became part of his downfall. So when you read those words, God hardened Pharaoh's heart, don't rush past them. Ask yourself, was God creating Pharaoh's stubbornness? Or was God allowing Pharaoh's own choices to become the path he continued walking? That question has been debated for centuries, and maybe that's exactly why the story remains so fascinating. Because the story of Pharaoh isn't only about ancient Egypt, it's also about the human heart. How many times can we reject something before rejection becomes a habit? And perhaps the biggest question isn't, why did Pharaoh harden his heart? Maybe it's, what happens when we keep hardening ours? If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Thinker's Lane, where we don't just tell ancient stories. We ask the questions hiding behind them.